I am really excited to show you something that we believe will revolutionize how teams do testing, and that is automatic test creation in Cypress powered by AI. But before I dive in, I want to take a moment to share our philosophy about AI in testing. We believe that AI should enhance your testing expertise, not replace it. While AI can handle repetitive tasks and provide intelligent suggestions, human judgment remains essential for strategic testing decisions. Our goal is not to remove humans from testing, it's to give teams superpowers by automating the tedious parts while keeping you in control of your testing strategy. With that in mind, what makes our approach unique is that we're not just applying AI for AI's sake. We're bringing AI capabilities that truly understand your application, your testing patterns, and exactly what needs testing. This context-aware approach ensures that AI becomes a natural extension of your testing workflow rather than a black box generating unpredictable code. So to get us started, I'll briefly outline what we'll cover today. So we'll start off with talking about the test coverage challenges that teams face, how Cypress AI addresses them by creating targeted tests to match your patterns. We'll do a preview of our brand new Cypress Studio experience, and then end off with how to get started with early access to these products. Let me start off with a challenge that every testing team faces, one that becomes exponentially harder as applications grow. The core issue is that test coverage doesn't scale linearly with your application. If you think about it, every new feature requires essentially a multiple of the number of scenarios that you then need to test. You can't just keep adding QA engineers forever. That's not sustainable. And deep knowledge about different parts of your application gets scattered across the team. And when teams can't keep the pace of this growing testing demand, three things typically happen. Changes start to break existing functionality because critical paths weren't tested. Teams rush to add coverage, leading to overlapping and inconsistent tests. And deployment confidence drops because no one's quite sure what might break. So to actually solve this, teams need more than just coverage metrics. They need a systematic way to track test coverage across complex user flows and clear direction on how to handle all these interactions properly, from setup to async handling, and critically, tests that follow their team's patterns and actually stay maintainable. This problem of identifying and closing coverage gaps while maintaining quality is exactly what drove us to create UI coverage. About a year ago, we launched a brand new approach to test coverage. Rather than giving you code coverage percentages or statistics, UI coverage actually looks at your application from your user's perspective, analyzing every interactive element, button, form, etc., that they may encounter. And this dynamic overlay becomes your guide to making strategic testing decisions by essentially mapping everything that a user can do in your application and whether those things are covered by your tests. When you run your tests with UI coverage, it analyzes every interaction that happens in those tests. But the powerful thing is it's not just necessarily recording what's tested, it's creating a complete map of your application and its surface area. And in a UI coverage report, you can instantly see which critical user flows have gaps, which risky areas of your application need testing, and where and how elements are used across the different states of your application. And this transformed how teams using Cypress approach coverage because they're no longer guessing. They can systematically identify untested elements and understand exactly which user flows need testing. UI coverage gives teams the data they need to make informed decisions about where to focus their testing efforts. But, and this is crucial, while UI coverage brilliantly solves this what needs testing problem, teams still face a significant challenge with the how to test it part. Even when you know exactly which element needs coverage, you still need deep knowledge of both the application behavior and the testing requirements. You have to build tests that match your team's patterns and best practices. And it takes serious engineering time to get all of this right. So the question arises, how do we break through this test creation bottleneck? How do we make it faster and easier to write good tests without sacrificing quality? And could AI be something that helps us do that? And I'm sure many of you have even explored using AI to solve this problem. And if you have, then you will have seen that these approaches still have really significant limitations. Typically, to kind of illustrate how this currently works, you'll typically spend time crafting a prompt and explaining your application, adding in context, describing what you want to test, and the AI model will use that to develop a testing approach. And typically, this actually is quite accurate and reasonable based on the context that you give it. And finally, the AI will use this approach to create an actual test that actually looks quite perfect at first glance. But the problems with this approach are prompting a model in this way requires a lot of specificity upfront, and it's often as much work as just writing the test. And even though it results in what seems like a valid test, when you actually try to run it, oftentimes it fails. And that's because these outputs have problems like not using the selectors that actually exist in your application, making assumptions about application state that don't actually match reality, missing crucial setup steps. And ultimately, this all leads to tests that don't actually work. And even by providing more and more context, the fundamental problem remains that these tools are essentially trying to write tests while being blind to how your application actually works. And to truly solve this problem, we need something fundamentally different. We need a solution that sees your application and has full access to the runtime environment, understands the DOM structure and state changes, and can observe things like network requests and asynchronous behaviors. We also need something that understands your team's patterns and best practices and recognizes things like custom commands and utilities that you use. And most importantly, we need something that can combine all of this knowledge together to generate tests that actually work. And this is where Cypress has a very unique advantage. Through our protocol, we already have a deep insight into how your application behaves, how your tests work, and what patterns lead to reliable tests. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. So I'm going to be demonstrating this using our real-world app, which is a demo application that we created to showcase real-world testing scenarios. It's a simple payment app where users can send and request money from each other. So I'll start off here by looking at a UI coverage report where we can track test coverage of these interactive elements across our application. And we can see that here we have a request button that currently has no coverage. This button initiates a payment request flow, which is a core piece of functionality for this product. And we definitely want to make sure that's tested. So let's see how Cypress AI can help us create a test for this. When I click on Generate Test Code and select a spec where I want to add my test, Cypress is analyzing several things. It's looking at the button's context within the application, how similar functionality is tested in our specs, what setup is needed to reach this element, the best way to reliably select this element. And we can see that the test code for completing this request flow is automatically then generated by Cypress AI. And the test that's created essentially gets to the correct state of this application, replicates kind of the correct setup code to test this particular element, and actually performs the interaction to complete the flow. And some interesting things that you may notice is that this test actually uses some commands that are not vanilla Cypress commands, like this get by cell and get by cell like custom commands. And the reason for that is that the real world app itself in its test suite actually defines a couple of these custom Cypress commands. And Cypress AI actually has knowledge of all of this. So what it's able to do is, instead of just kind of taking vanilla Cypress and putting in raw selectors, it's able to kind of interpret your existing testing patterns and generate new tests that I can put essentially directly into our test suite, into our spec, and have them work with minimal to no modification. So what I'll do now is I will copy this code, and I will go ahead and put it into the new transaction spec, which is where I want to add this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a dot only on this it. Save that. And we're going to go ahead and see how this works in Cypress. So I have Cypress spun up already, and I can see that this is our new transaction spec that we've modified just a couple of seconds ago. And what we can see is this test that was generated by Cypress AI has actually gone in and performed this request flow for us. So it has actually performed kind of all the setup and login steps to get to the correct point in our application where it fills out the form. It creates these values to fill out in the test, and then it actually performs the click and gets to a state where the transaction was successfully submitted. Now, one thing to notice here is that the test is still not actually complete because there are no assertions, for example, to ensure that the application's behavior was correct. And that's because Cypress Cloud, although it generates this test, it doesn't actually run it. You have to do that locally. So we need knowledge of what happens next, what happens once we perform this interaction in order to then complete this test, which brings us to the next aspect of these improvements, which I am very excited to share. What we're building next is we're actually bringing this intelligence right into your authoring experience. And to do that, we're building this into Cypress Studio. So it's available right in the Cypress app. So for those of you who have not used or seen Studio, Studio is essentially currently an experimental feature in Cypress that records your actions with the application under test and generates basic test code to replicate those actions. It allows you to create new tests and write them through a kind of point and click experience and add assertions throughout. And what I'm really excited to talk about is how this year we're leveling up that test authoring experience in Cypress with an all new Studio experience. First of all, we're going to be moving Studio out from its experimental status to beta, meaning it's more stable and will have a first-class home in the Cypress app. We're also going to be giving Studio a UI refresh, including being able to write and modify test code directly in Cypress. And finally, we're improving the authoring experience so that you can actually iterate on a single test in isolation, editing and rerunning it in a tight feedback loop, even without all of those .onlys that I know you all love so much. Now, to highlight these changes, we're going to go ahead and finish that test that we generated in UI coverage by using Cypress Studio. And what I'm going to be showing next is a design prototype. So we're in the process of rolling out test creation in UI coverage right now. And the Studio side of things is something that we're beginning to work on next. So what this is, it's going to be a preview of how we expect this new AI-powered Cypress Studio to work and what you have to look forward to throughout the rest of this year. So I'll go ahead and jump into the first example here. We'll start off with the state that we got to from UI coverage. Of course, it's a touch different, you may notice, if you're looking closely, in that the actual request value and name, for example, might be different. And this is just because the models, of course, may generate different values in different executions. And where Cypress AI comes in is when we load up Studio, it'll actually begin to immediately analyze the state of your application in the test. And in this scenario, what we would demonstrate is that we can actually, Cypress Studio can look at the state change and identify what has happened after this interaction was performed. So in this scenario, Cypress Studio would actually be able to identify that this request was created successfully and then propose an assertion for our test automatically. And the test code that's being recommended here is actually asserting that this success toast appears on the page and is visible and has the correct text. So as a user, what we can do now is we can actually accept this recommendation. We see it gets added into our test directly. And we can also see that it's using the kind of correct custom commands and patterns that we've used elsewhere in our test suite as well. So what we want to do now in this test is make sure that the request is showing up correctly in the transactions list. So what I'll go ahead and do is click on the return to transactions button in this application. And then I want to go to my transactions. So I'll click on mine. Now, what we can see that this did is, just like Studio today, is it added the test code that Cypress would need in order to perform these same interactions within the scope of your test. One difference to note is that because Cypress AI is in play now, the test code that's added for the interactions also uses appropriate custom commands, more dynamic and flake-resistant selectors, and generally matches the patterns of your existing test suite much more closely. And we'll notice that now that we've landed on this state, we can again look at kind of what would Cypress AI do in this situation once we're at the state. And we would see that Cypress AI is actually able to, again, recommend an assertion for the list items in this list in particular now. So we make sure that this request that we've created actually appears in the transactions. It can obviously know this because it sees everything that we've performed up to this point and the kinds of things that we're asserting, for example. And we would go ahead and again accept this recommendation. It gets added into our code. And once we're done, we're able to then save this test. So all of our changes would actually get written to our spec file, and the test would rerun accordingly. So what we've seen now up to this point is effectively being able to start a test in UI coverage by looking at a particular untested element as the starting point, and then pulling that into Cypress Studio to complete a test. And this is kind of a demonstration of what the end-to-end flow would look like by combining these two products as you're kind of analyzing your coverage gaps and then pulling it into your local workflow to complete those tests. Now, for the next example I'll show, we're going to illustrate what it would look like to actually go completely end-to-end just within Studio to create tests without UI coverage and without needing to kind of wait for UI coverage to analyze our application. So on this initial state, I'm going to be testing the bank account deletion flow for the real world app. Perhaps we just implemented that functionality, or maybe we know that there is some change that we need to go and test. So what I'll do is start in my bank accounts spec in this case. And what Studio will allow you to do is create a new test in this particular spec directly in Cypress. And we can name it accordingly, which will also do things like inform the Cypress AI system what you are kind of intending to do with this test as well. So we're essentially giving it additional information so it can more accurately help us complete this test. And the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to, just like in Cypress Studio today, and just like you would for a kind of regular page, I'm going to go and type the bank account's URL into Cypress because we know that's where this like deletion flow and deletion action actually lives. So once we do that, we'll see our application is redirected to that page, which has a single bank account in it. And we can also see that Studio has added a visit command to replicate what we just did. So it's already begun writing this test for us and kind of matching the interactions that we're performing in Cypress on our application. And again, as Cypress AI sees our commands, application states, as well as knowing what we're testing by the way of how we named our test, it's able to essentially use all that information to predictively and generatively recommend like what the next action for the test is and essentially autocomplete the test for us. So in this scenario, it sees this list of bank accounts and it's able to, again, predictively autocomplete the fact that we want to click the delete button as part of our account deletion flow. So what we'll do this here is we do indeed want to hit that delete button. So we can add that to our test. And we can see that in this next state, this deletion was indeed successful. So the bank account text has deleted now in order to signal this. So what we probably want to do here is assert that that state change was successful. And Cypress AI can see this as well. And it can also similarly make a recommendation on this post-interaction state by looking at the different state changes and actions that we performed. And it's able to, again, recommend an assertion in this case to, again, make sure that the state change was performed accurately and correctly. So in this case, we would, again, add this into our test. We now see that we have a complete test that was written entirely by Cypress Studio, created from scratch. And with this, that's pretty much all we need for like a simplified version of this deletes a bank account test. And with that, we can kind of see how we're able to use Studio to basically go end to end from starting from an empty, even spec potentially, to creating tests, saving them to that spec, and then iterating and running them all within Cypress Studio itself. And that's where we see this future of Cypress Studio heading. Now, so we've kind of talked a lot about all of the new AI capabilities in Studio, and these capabilities are all actually going to be included with a UI coverage subscription in Cypress Cloud. But even if you aren't going to be able to take advantage of that, it's important to note that many of these enhancements that we're making to Studio are actually coming all included with the open source Cypress app, including a lot of this streamlined test creation and editing within Cypress itself, tracing errors back into your code, and adding Cypress commands through the interactions with your application. So the differences here, of course, are actually going to be around the AI capabilities in particular. So while we showed Studio providing automatic actions and assertions as recommendations, Studio without AI won't actually have these capabilities, but you'll still be able to manually interact with your application to create action commands and assertions, which is the same way that Studio works today. The other difference worth calling out here is that the AI-powered Studio, when code is generated, it'll actually match your existing testing patterns. So it'll do things like look at your other specs and tests and essentially make sure that all of the generated code, rather than using just kind of vanilla Cypress, it's actually matching the custom commands that you use, the setup logic that you use, general command structure and patterns. Whereas right now, if you've used Studio, for example, you'll see that Studio will typically use kind of vanilla Cypress code and then default kind of best practice element selectors as they're available. And one of the big differences here is Studio can actually more intelligently look at things like the DOM and generate more flake-resistant selectors than potentially simply like an algorithmic approach would be able to without AI. And the really important thing to note is that both of these approaches, both with and without AI, help you create reliable tests. The AI-powered version just has more capability to more flexibly adapt to your team's specific patterns and practices, while the fully open source version provides the kind of foundation for this using Cypress defaults that you can then go and of course change. The core functionality of recording interactions and generating working test code remains the same, which ensures that you can create effective tests regardless of which approach you're using. Now, let's talk briefly about how we're rolling out these new features and how you can get early access. We kind of went over today test creation and Cypress AI being built into two different products, UI coverage and Cypress Studio. And we're rolling out the beta of test creation in UI coverage in Cypress Cloud this quarter. And that's the first real release of this that we're banking on. By starting a trial of UI coverage and signing up for that, you will actually be one of the first to use a Cypress AI as we begin to bake it into our products. And there's a link to sign up for a UI coverage trial in the Docs tab of this platform. I would definitely encourage you to head over and sign up even right now. And I'm really excited to working with teams that sign up and your team to essentially make test writing in general for your processes easier, faster, more effective. And I'm really excited about the work under development, revamping Cypress Studio, and you can definitely expect to hear updates on this throughout the year. AI will really transform how teams create and maintain tests. AI also has the ability to transform how teams debug and fix test failures and monitor and analyze trends and insights in your test suite. And as we build towards this vision of AI-enhanced testing, we're really excited to partner with teams like yours and work closely to make sure that we're building AI, again, for our customers for the right reasons and to really revolutionize your testing processes. Thank you, everyone, for your time, and thank you for joining us here.
Peter, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm really excited about some of the innovations that the Cypress team is working on. And I want to take a minute and ask you a couple of questions. And I'm just going to dive right into the one that I think is probably at the top of everyone's mind. What kind of data does Cypress need access to for the AI features to work?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting point because Cypress actually has a strong advantage here. Most solutions will actually use things like your kind of production application code in order to make decisions around what tests they write or code that it generates. And we actually don't need access to your production code. What Cypress AI actually does is it takes these events and runtime data that we already kind of see as you're running and recording your tests up to Cypress Cloud. And we use that to actually create even better results than we would if we had to essentially like read any production or application code and then try to like interpret the behavior of your application based on your production code. So Cypress is actually able to rely on the data and the runtime behaviors that actually happened rather than trying to read your more proprietary code and then try to guess based on that what would have happened. So this is really cool because, again, it happens all within the existing Cypress Cloud ecosystem and infrastructure. It doesn't require data that we don't already use and process and kind of work with in terms of your tests and optimizing your tests, analyzing your tests anyway. So it actually is quite a low barrier compared to like if we were to do things like try to interpret application code. So that's one of the reasons that we're able to kind of start working with our customers on this pretty early, is because we have kind of more correct and also more reasonable information in order to make these kinds of decisions.
That's incredible. This really does sound like a true plug and play solution. I'm going to continue on with some more questions that I know are at the top of everyone's mind. So I noticed that these AI capabilities, they look like they are primarily built for existing test suites. How does it support a project that is building a test suite from scratch?
So the way that Cypress AI is able to do things like match your testing patterns, for example,
Mhm.
is indeed like by looking at your existing tests. Of course, it's able to look at like the custom commands you've configured and other configurations that you've added in Cypress, the way that you typically kind of define behaviors in your tests. But uh, in the real world, Cypress AI and test creation is equally valuable for new projects. And that's specifically because when you're starting fresh with a new project, Cypress AI will default to generating tests that follow best practices. So using things like reasonable and maintainable selectors and properly kind of handling behaviors and assertions the way that Cypress's best practices would prescribe, and kind of using common patterns that we've seen be successful with our customers. So this actually in some ways gives new projects an advantage, because you kind of start off structuring your tests in a way that like very much biases for Cypress best practices, and generally like starts off and stays maintainable as your test suite grows. And then, of course, as you adopt any custom patterns or changes or conventions, Cypress AI will then also take those into account and sort of factor those in as it begins to kind of as your test suite begins to grow, and as, of course, test creation begins to grow with your test suite.
Yeah, that is incredible. Especially, if your team is just starting out and you're not even sure on, the standards that you're going to implement, like having the ability to know that you're starting off on the right path. I think that's really incredible. Okay, I have another one, and it's one that you actually kind of alluded to in your presentation. There has been so much community conversation about AI replacing jobs within the test automation community. So I want to know, how do you see the newest AI capabilities modifying the role and responsibilities of developers and QA engineers?
Yeah, and I spoke to this a little bit at the very beginning here. The way that we are approaching AI at Cypress is a tool to make QA professionals more effective, not replace them. So there are always going to be very critical aspects of testing that require human judgment, meaning deciding what scenarios are most important to test, understanding the actual business logic that needs validation, architecting test suites that can actually continue to scale with your application, and ensuring that these tests that are being generated or written produce meaningful signals and actually matter. What the AI is actually really valuable for is kind of handling the time consuming implementation, meaning things like translating requirements into actual test code, or maintaining selectors so you don't have things change in your application and break all your tests, and updating assertions as logic updates. So what this really allows you to do is focus on the more strategic aspects of testing, while AI kind of handles the more tactical, mechanical parts. And yeah, I think this is really important because there is always going to be this human aspect. Like there is always going to be the need for these decisions that only someone who understands the business and understands the requirements is going to be able to make. So I really do think of AI as kind of like a pair programmer or an assistant that knows all about Cypress best practices, that can implement them, that can ensure that everything that you're implementing is going to be kind of consistent and successful. But the human is always still going to be, and the QA professional is always still going to be driving the testing strategy. The AI is really just helping you execute at a much, much higher rate.
Excellent. Peter, thank you so much for your presentation and for your thoughtful answers to these questions. We really appreciate it. As we wrap up today's session, I want to take a moment and thank all of you for joining us. It has been incredible to see such a vibrant turnout from the global testing community. Your enthusiasm for advancing the craft of test automation is definitely something that we share here at Cypress. We are excited about the role automatic test generation will play in helping your teams streamline their testing workflows. As a quick reminder, the recording of this webinar will be sent out to all registrants later this week, so keep an eye out on your inbox. And if you haven't already, make sure to visit the Docs tab, click that UI coverage trial link, go ahead and fill out that form before you even log out so you don't miss the chance to be among the first to experience these features that we're working on. Thank you again for spending your time with us today. Together, we are shaping the future of test automation, and we couldn't be more excited to have you along this journey. Until next time, take care, keep testing, and we'll see you later.